listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week is the third of our partnership series with the European Research Network on Philanthropy, or ERNOP, where I talk to academics whose work has been featured in the most recent of ERNOP's Research Notes series. Now, this Research Notes series, as previous listeners will know, the aim of it is to get practitioners to write summaries of recent or kind of academic work from over the last few years in the field of philanthropy, in a bid to try and make it more accessible to a wider audience. And as part of that, I'm also partnering with ERNOP to try and do that also in audio form. So we've got three great guests again for you this time round. So we've got Marlou Ramaekers, who's a research associate in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Vrije Universitat in Amsterdam. We've got Nina Sooter, who's a PhD student and a teaching assistant at the Finance Research Institute at the University of Geneva, and also works there in the sort of behavioural philanthropy lab as well. And we've got Livia Ventura, who's the Prince of Wales Global Sustainability Fellow in Business Transformation and New Corporate Forms, which is a mouthful, at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So I'll introduce each of them a little bit as we go through the segments and just tell you a bit about what the actual work that they're talking about is, although that should become pretty apparent as we go through the conversations. So without further ado, let's get into it. First up is Marlou Ramaekers, and Marlou is talking about a really interesting paper that she wrote a couple of years ago, all about informal volunteering and socialisation effects, and looking at the role that both parents and partners play in influencing informal volunteering. So let's hear from Marlou. Okay, great. So I'm here with Marlou Ramaekers. Hi, Marlou.
Hi.
Great to have a chance to talk to you on the podcast about the work that you've got featured in the most recent ERNOP Research Notes series. And it's a paper all about the relationship between informal volunteering and socialization effects. So it's really interesting, and maybe the best place to start is just for you to tell us a bit about what the research was all about, how it came about, and what the key findings were.
Right, thank you. So the paper is part of my PhD dissertation, and we started the idea was that we saw in a lot of research on volunteering that volunteering for an organization, that family is very important in that, and what family members also engage in volunteering behavior. And we have focused specifically on informal volunteering, so that's volunteering not for an organization but more informally directly to a person. And we thought, hey, maybe these socialization effects are also present for informal volunteering. So that's what the starting point was. And then we looked at various forms of socialization. So in theory about this, we generally distinguish between three forms of socialization practices, so to say. We did not focus on reinforcements for a whole lot of reasons, but specifically focused on modeling and on encouragement. And we focused on two important figures during a person's life. So for childhood, we focused on parents because they're seen as sort of the primary socialization agents. And then for adulthood, we focus on romantic partners. So that's spouses, but also people you are in relationship with that live with you. And we wanted to see whether these practices influenced people's informal volunteering behavior and whether it mattered who did them. And in the end, we found that modeling was important irrespective of whether the parents or the partner did it. And for encouragement, we only found effects for the partner. And we are not completely sure why we did not find any parental effects. And we haven't, but this is speculation. Obviously, we have a sense that might be because a lot of parents do this, encourage pro-social behavior to some extent. I don't think there will be any parents who will be like, oh, you should never help other people. That's a bad thing to do. So it might be our measurement that was not optimal for measuring the differences, because I can imagine there can be parents who are like, yeah, this is a good thing. And then there are parents who really emphasize this during, when growing up. So so we might find something if we looked into this deeper. But yeah, that's the paper in a nutshell.
Yeah. And so to clarify, I guess for people listening, the difference there, which maybe a lot of parents will feel does reflect their experience, is that it's effective to show children what to do by modeling the behavior. But actually, when you tell them, it turns out it seems as though that's a less effective way of kind of getting them to act
that's
socially.
What we found. So if people engage in, and we used volunteering for an organization as sort of modeling helping behavior and for pro-social behavior to a child as a way of modeling. So if parents did that, their children in adulthood, so that's actually quite a long time between them doing it and their children acting more helpfully, so to say, that children would engage more in informal volunteering.
Yeah, and you were saying there about the possible the explanations for that might be that there is a sort of genuine phenomenon, and it might tell you something about the nature of the data. What, just so that people kind of know, what was the data on which you were basing the research, and particularly, I guess I'm thinking, was the evidence about the effect of parental encouragement or modelling, is that based on the individual's recollection about it later on?
Yes. So what we did is we used survey data from the Netherlands, and we asked people to report whether their parents volunteered when they were around 15 years old. Although pro-social development, it takes much longer and starts at a very young age, there's also some research that indicates that this is sort of a prime formative period in a child's life. And then we asked adults to report on what their parents did regarding to volunteering for an organization, but also whether they would say that their parents always encouraged them to help others and always stressed that it was important to help others. So that's how we approach it. There might be, these type of research is always complicated because there could be a slight bias in that, but obviously it's very expensive and also very difficult to find sort of interview parents when the child is 15 years old and then see them like 15 years or 20 years or 25 years later and say, hey, how are you doing now? So less optimal, but still relatively effective. I would say we chose for sort of a retrospective question.
Yeah, and I guess it's always a challenge with anything where you're trying to determine motivations about giving, in that there's an element of self-reporting, or people aren't necessarily good at knowing exactly what it is that drives their own generosity. So it's really interesting. I wanted to ask, actually, when I was reading the paper, maybe a sort of slightly more speculative question about how this applies in a wider context. Do you have any sense that there might be a danger that some of the ways that we're now choosing to engage in social action, so giving online or doing forms of volunteering that aren't necessarily as visible, might lead to a reduction in the effects of modelling? Because even if parents are doing it, their children can't see that they're doing it in the same way.
Right. No. Obviously, I cannot, against speculation, but I can totally imagine that. I think that's one of the key parts of modeling, is that a child sees that a parent does it. So in that sense, volunteering for an organization, for example, a sports association or a local community center where the child is also present, is way more effective than if a parent volunteers online in the evening when the child has already gone to bed. So in that sense, yeah, I can imagine that could be part of it. And that could also apply for other ways of giving, and then more on the donations, the monetary donation side. I can also imagine that, but obviously that was not what the specific paper was about. But yeah, I can see that could be.
Yeah, and definitely maybe a interesting area for future research for someone as well. I just wanted to ask, actually, because obviously the purpose of the research note series that ERNOP's doing is to try and get better connections between academic work on philanthropy and kind of practice and policy making. So I mean first of all, in terms of your own paper, what do you think are the kind of useful things that practitioners or policymakers can take from the findings, even if they're not definitive, just as to kind of guide their thinking?
Yeah, I would say there's maybe two things. I want to preface this with saying that the issue for practitioners with informal volunteering is that obviously it's not organized. So if you have a voluntary organization, you cannot really dip your toe into this because it's by definition not organized. That being said, I think there's two takeaways that can be useful for practitioners. So at least for the informal volunteering, we found indications that people are not set in stone after childhood. So there is a whole lot of research about pro-social development during childhood, and that sort of gives an indication that a person is sort of done after when they reach adulthood. But at least our findings for partners and partner socialization indicate that there might be options for people to influence others to be more pro-social, engage more in volunteering behavior, or other philanthropic behavior could also possibly be on that receiving end. And I think the other thing is that we found obviously that when a partner or when parents volunteer for an organization, that this spills over sort of to their partner or children in terms of informal volunteering. So I guess this emphasizes the importance of engaging people in volunteering and having them also, to some extent, at least make that visible and involve their loved ones into that, because that seemingly spills over, not possibly only into these other people also engaging in volunteering for an organization, but also into informal volunteering. So I think that also maybe is useful for practitioners to know how important it is to make it visible and to engage people.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like really useful insights. And I guess just sort of taking that point more broadly, it feels as though those are useful things that practitioners can take from your work. What's your experience so far of the links between academia and practice in philanthropy? Do you think that it's easy to get academic insight to practitioners, or do you think there are challenges in doing that, and what might those be?
For me personally, I feel like the philanthropy field is generally relatively well connected between organizations in practice and academics. When I go to conferences, I meet quite a lot of practitioners, and I get the feeling, if I read the research, that there's also there's a good connection between research and practice. But for me personally, I have always focused on the informal side, and I've always struggled. But that's also from my own side. I have to admit that I don't really know. So it's sometimes difficult to reach out to practitioners then, because I want to give them something that they can use, and sometimes my results are most like, okay, so informal volunteering doesn't do this very well, so maybe you should pick up the slack here. And that's not really, I find it a difficult message to communicate, but I would also say that also on my end, I have found that people, when I meet them and I talk about my research, they are very interested. So I think, that has been my experience, but I definitely see lots of avenues where there is a connection being made between academia and practice, and including this podcast.
Well, it's great to hear. And it feels as though there's a lot more interest in informal modes of social action and how they relate to formal modes at the moment, I guess, because, everybody's aware of kind of groundswells of mutual aid and informal volunteering. So even if they don't quite know what to do about it, they are interested in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just wanted to ask before I let you go, it's been really great having a chance to talk. Obviously, I know that often people have worked on these papers, a reasonable time ago in the past. So you're obviously probably doing other things now. What is it that you're working on at the moment? Is it a follow-up to this research, or are you kind of looking at other areas?
Both. I am currently not working at the Radboud University anymore, but at the Vrije Universitat Amsterdam. So I now work at the Giving in the Netherlands project, which we sort of describe the entire sector in the Netherlands every 2 years. And I'm mostly doing the quantitative data part for that, but also working on giving, on volunteering by households. But I have to say that I'm also working on a sort of follow-up on this paper, because one of the things that we also acknowledge in the results, the discussion section, is that we cannot really disentangle whether pro-social people are more likely to form a relationship or whether people influence each other. And a follow-up paper that I'm working on now is sort of to disentangle that a bit more, where we can say more strongly, like, oh, okay, so it's if one partner engages in informal volunteering, then the other partner after that also becomes more likely to engage in that. And preliminary results indeed show that that's the case. So that's great. But I have to do some finishing touches on that research now.
Oh, it sounds really interesting. I will definitely, be interested to hear more about that when the research is out. Listen, it remains just to say thanks ever so much for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's been great to hear about the research and what you're working on now, and certainly all the best with it in the future.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, following on from that really interesting conversation with Marlou, next up we have Nina Sooter talking about another fascinating paper in this series, all about virtual reality and kind of exploring the potential of virtual reality as a tool for fundraising, something that I'm personally really fascinated by. So without further ado, let's hear from Nina. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Nina Sooter. Hi there, Nina.
Hi.
And Nina is currently doing a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Geneva and has done some work with their behavioural philanthropy lab. And the paper that we're going to talk about today, I think, has come about as part of that. And it's a really interesting paper about the use of virtual reality for fundraising and some of the sort of potential in that. So maybe the best place to start, if you could just tell us a bit about how the paper came about, what the kind of main aim of it is, and what some of the key findings were.
Yeah, so the idea for the paper actually came about through our interaction with the International Red Cross Committee, or the ICRC. So they had these VR modules that they were using to train their internal agents. And they were wondering whether it would be a good idea to adapt them to use for fundraising. And so they asked if we'd be willing to collaborate with them on this. So that's where the idea came from. And then we worked together with them closely pretty much throughout the study.
And what was, in terms of adapting it, what was the training module kind of adapted to do, and what were the sort of hypotheses that you were testing through this?
So the training module was basically to train agents to be in war zones. So the module is set in an urban combat zone, and you have to rescue an unconscious child. So our idea for adaptation was to make it a bit more interactive, make the person interact a bit more with the child. And then what we had them do was be on the phone with an ICRC agent who was helping them navigate this urban conflict zone to try and get the child to safety at the end. And then we tried to modify certain things that we were trying to test as well. So we worked with our VR team to do that.
And what were the kind of things that you were testing, and what did you find? I'm assuming it's about the kind of the utility of VR, and is it about how that compares to traditional fundraising, or about different types of VR experiences? Because I know there was mention in the paper of two different sort of A/B versions, one that had a positive outcome and one that had a negative. So it'd be really interesting to hear what the differences were there, if any.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll give you first the general premise a bit more. So we're interested in how to attract primarily younger donors, because there's this, famous wealth transfer between generations that is happening, and millennials have a bit of a different relationship to engaging with philanthropy. Like, we like to connect to causes. We don't just like to give our money and not know what's going to happen to it. So we like to see the impact. We like to know a bit more about what the organization is doing and kind of accompany it. And another thing about us is we like to get our information through technology, and we're very into doing research and using more modern medium. And a lot of the ICRC, in general, a lot of philanthropic initiatives require more dated medium. So they'll send letters or they'll have people approach you in the street, but there's not really anything that helps to connect the donor to the donees per se. And so we thought that VR could be a good way to do this, because we can't take people and put them in war-torn zones, but we can give them a taste of what it might be like. And so the idea was to take this module that they already had and to use it with primarily young people, and to see if this would help them to connect a bit more with the cause and to realize a bit more what the ICRC is trying to do, and if this would result in more donations. So yes, we wanted to look at different things. So previous studies, there are a few studies that already looked at VR and donations in the past, and they found that sometimes the kind of scenario affected the donation. So they found there was this one study that looked at the effects of the environment, and they looked at negative versus positive scenarios. And so we wanted to see whether having a negative ending versus a positive ending might make people more likely to donate. We also played with interactivity a little bit. So we had some scenarios which were more interactive. People could pick up, for example, a white flag to wave around when there was a tank passing by to show that they were innocent, or they could decide a bit more where to move in the scenario and how to proceed. Whereas there was a passive version as well, where they kind of just were taken through the scenario without having to do it. So we wanted to see if this interactivity could help with the immersion and with the engagement, really, with the avatars and the characters that were in the scenario. So what we did is we compared this scenario in VR to the same scenario with the same level of interactivity and the same endings on a computer screen. So on the computer screen, basically they moved around using the mouse, and they could still have a 360 view if they wanted to, but it was less immersive. And so we wanted to see whether it was the story itself or the technology which was driving our effect.
And what were the kind of findings around that? Because I think that's a really fascinating question about whether it is just the medium that is different and maybe more engaging because it's technologically driven, or whether there is something actually in the affordance of the technology that develops more empathy or more connection, or whether actually if you just tell a good story in whatever medium, that's an effective method of fundraising.
Yeah, so we had some very interesting findings, actually. We only found a significant effect for VR itself, so the medium. However, when we looked at what might be driving this, so we had physiological recordings throughout the study to see basically how excited people were getting, how physiologically aroused they were during the study. And we found that people in the VR scenarios had a much higher physiological level of arousal. However, that wasn't what was driving their donations. So what we saw was that, like you said, it was the aspects that were more related to good storytelling. So we saw that people in the VR scenario, they reported much stronger feelings of being moved. And they also reported more sadness, which, due to the nature of the scenario, is to be expected. And these feelings were actually linked to higher donations. So it seems like they were more touched by the story in the VR scenario, and that was correlated with donating more. Another thing that was interesting was we asked them about their general perspective on the experience. So if they thought it was interesting, if they thought it was exciting or enriching. And people in the VR scenario seemed to appreciate the experience a lot more. And this finding the scenario more interesting and more enriching actually also led to higher donations too. So it seems that people who appreciate the scenario or get something personally from the scenario are also then willing to give back in terms of donations, which is interesting. So I think the medium is important. So like being immersed and having this kind of embodied experience is important. But we also found the importance of good storytelling and writing things that people can connect with.
And I noticed at one point in the paper that another thing you did was try to determine the level of prior experience people had of VR. Because I guess another question is there an element of the effect of it being slightly down to novelty? And actually, the more that you get accustomed to VR, the less effective it becomes. Did you find anything there?
Yeah, so we tried to look at that, but unfortunately, most people in our study, or maybe fortunately, hadn't had extensive experience with VR before. So only a few people had experienced VR many times. Most people had done it once or maybe a few times. So we didn't find a novelty effect, but it could be that it was just very novel for most people. And then as time goes on and as people become more and more familiar with VR, time will tell whether it's the effect of novelty or whether it's the medium itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess an interesting piece of research perhaps for a few years' time when people become more generally accustomed to VR. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask, which again maybe is a slightly wider question and more speculative, but did you get any sense within the experiment that you were working on of some of the potential ethical concerns we might need to bear in mind when we're thinking about using this tool? Because it seems as though it does have utility and potentially power, but it might also raise all kinds of questions about what is or isn't appropriate in terms of giving people experiences and trying to manipulate their empathy and emotions.
Yes, I think that there's an interesting paper about this. I can't quite remember who it's from, which talked exactly about this. So the ethical implications of manipulating people's emotions in order to get their donations, and whether this is something that one should do or not. And I think it's still an open question, honestly. I think we do have an argument in the paper too that VR can also help to enhance information transfer. So rather than just appealing to enhanced emotions, we can also present rational arguments or just give them an idea of the logistics of a situation, for example, which would then also maybe increase donations that way too. So I agree that it's a bit of a gray area as to whether people should be more emotionally manipulated, but I think that giving people a chance to experience what the impact of their philanthropic activities is great. And I think that you can do it in many different ways that don't all require emotion. So one idea that we had was also if you have like a task that where we didn't have this in our VR scenario, but it was an idea for maybe future scenarios where the interactivity element is directly related to the outcome. So you have maybe a logistical problem to solve, or you have some sort of interaction that you need to do, and you need to succeed in order to have the desired outcome at the end. And I think that this is also a way of doing it that maybe stimulates more people's interest and their immersion in that way. So you're not playing the emotion card, but it could still be a way to help people to connect to different causes. And I think the truth is also it's very hard to divorce emotions completely from any kind of thought. So people are going to be experiencing emotions as they do different things, and it's not necessarily a good or bad thing.
It's obviously still relatively sort of early days in terms of the use of VR within fundraising. But at this point, what kind of insights do you think this work can offer for practitioners or people in the field of practice who are thinking about experimenting with VR?
Yeah, I think one thing that we help answer is whether it's worth it, because there's an additional cost, of course, to develop VR modules and to disseminate VR modules, right? It requires a lot more time and effort and technology than just mailing letters to people. So I think that what we try to show too is that, okay, VR is increasing donations, but it's by this much. So then it's like more or less up to you to decide, is it worth it or not? Or do you want to use it just for special occasions And I think that the fact that we found that storytelling elements are also very important can give people ideas for other ways that they can increase people's connectivity to this kind of thing without relying on the technology per se. So I think what we're telling people is, yes, VR is a good medium for this, and we found some effects, but there are also some other things you can do, and it's also good to consider whether VR is a good fit for you or not. So one thing that also I think would be a great follow-up study is that, and what we did was people came to the lab and then we put them in the VR or no VR condition. But what we found was that we had a lot of interest from participants in this study. So when people heard that there was a VR study going on at the university, we had a lot of people coming and volunteering. And so I think that VR also has a lot of power just to get people in the door and get people to interact where they might not just do it if someone approached them on the street to talk about an initiative. So I think that VR has potentially a lot of power there too, as you said, something novel, something exciting that people want to do. So it could be that it has stronger effects than what we've recorded because it's just attracting more people to want to talk to different philanthropic organizations and find out what's happening.
Which, I mean, as you say, for fundraisers in itself is a very practical finding potentially. You were saying you obviously worked with the ICRC on this study, so there was a kind of link automatically between practice and academia. One of the things in this kind of podcast series and the research note series that is a common thread is that question of what the links are like between academia and practice in the field of philanthropy. What's your sense of that? Do you find it relatively easy to get connection and to sort of disseminate your findings, or do you think there are still challenges when it comes to trying to get academic insight into practice?
I think there are a lot of challenges. I think that academics aren't always necessarily good at communicating their ideas. And I think that the kind of questions that interest academics are often not the same ones that interest practitioners. So I think we were very fortunate in that we worked with the ICRC from the beginning. So from the ideas of the experimental design, we asked them, okay, what kind of questions do you want answered? What do you want to know? And they were really interested, not just is VR effective, but what kind of modules should we be developing, which led us to have all of these, questions about what people were getting out of it and what they thought of the scenario as well, not just a measure of donations. So I think that if academics can talk more to practitioners at the early stages, it's helpful too, because instead of us just being like, oh, this is something we found out, and people are like, okay, we'll see if we can apply that, then we can ask, well, what kind of questions do you want us to investigate? And then I think that this partnership is, to me personally, is very interesting because I like research that's applicable in a more, let's say, real world or broader setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Just finally, before I let you go, what are you working on yourself at the moment? Are you kind of developing this research further, or are there other areas related to it that you're working on?
So there are some other ideas for this, but they haven't gotten off the ground yet. One of them is to do this field study to see if we can get more people to interact with philanthropy if VR is involved. Another study that we're looking at is people's ideas around B labs. So whether the B lab label, if it's being effective at communicating to people that companies have certain ethical standards, and whether A, the communication is effective, B, people trust the label, and see how it affects consumer choices. So it's another one with practical applications too.
Great. Well, that all sounds really interesting. So, be interested to see where all of that research goes. Just remains to say thanks ever so much, Nina, for finding time to come on the podcast. It's great to hear about the work. And obviously, I'll put links in the show notes to places where people can find the paper and the research note based on it.
Great. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and then last but very much not least for this episode, we have Livia Ventura talking about her work looking at the idea of the benefit corporation, or the B corporation, and trying to apply a theoretical lens to try and understand where this fits in some of the kind of thinking about classical economics and the purpose of corporate forms, and whether it represents a new form of firm altruism. So let's hear from Livia. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Dr. Livia Ventura. Hi there, Livia.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Great. Great to have you on the podcast. We're here primarily to talk about the paper that's featured in the most recent ERNOP Research series note. which is called Philanthropy and the For-Profit Corporation, the Benefit Corporation as a New Form of Firm Altruism. So it's a really interesting paper about the kind of blending of lines between the for-profit sphere and the not-for-profit sphere. So maybe the best place to start, if you could tell us a bit in your own words about what the focus of the paper is and how it came about and what the key findings are.
Sure, thank you so much. And well, the basic idea is to analyze how organizational forms for-profit corporations are changing towards the main goal of sustainability. So the paper is about the development of a new way of reading this kind of new structures. And so the basic idea is sustainability is now at the heart of the not only the political agenda, but also of the debate of corporate governance of business corporations. And so considering the historical traditional dichotomy between for-profit entities and not-for-profit entities, the development of these new hybrid or dual-purpose entities struggles to find the right space where, of course, in capitalist systems on one hand, and in the other hand, in the corporate governance debate or theories, if we want to call them as theories. So my paper tried to read the new hybrid entity development through different lenses, not the lenses of the homo economicus paradigm of neoclassical economics, but through behavioral law and economics and through the Yale approach to the economic analysis of law, in particular using Professor Calabresi categories. And so this is the attempt that I have done, try to categorize hybrid entities within the debate.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And maybe we could say a bit more about, for people listening, I mean, you sort of mentioned the kind of classical economic paradigm, which is essentially the idea of kind of homo economicus in a kind of rational, self-interested economic unit, just everybody doing things for their own self-interest. And altruism as a whole doesn't really fit very neatly into that, particularly not in the context of the sort of paradigm where that's how we think about for-profit corporations. What is it about the framework that Calabresi and others have put in place that allows you maybe to explain things a bit differently?
Yes, basically, as you were saying, we are used to think about for-profit corporation as selfish actor in the economic sphere, just with the goal to make profit and distribute profit without any limits to the owners of the company. And so they sticks perfectly with the neoclassical idea of the homo economicus. But the fact is that if we take a look at realities of so many studies that demonstrated, we have to say that altruism exists, beneficence exists, and the unselfish pro-social behavior is something that exists in human reality, in human life. And so basically, Professor Calabresi, through a different approach to the economic analysis of law, in his last book, The Future of Economic Analysis of Law, tried to describe altruism and beneficence as ends in themselves, as goods that people want to achieve and for the achievement of which they are willing to pay a price. So in this way, if we think at altruism with that lenses, we can see how hybrid entities and dual purpose companies can be legitimized into the economic theories, into the capitalist system, and so on. So I just try to put these lenses on this legal structure, and through them, I demonstrated that it's not irrational to create and to establish a dual purpose company, which is a company, this is maybe relevant to say, which is characterized by two main goals. The one is the profit goal. And the second one, which has the same exact value, or the first one, is the creation of a public benefit, common benefit, positive externalities, or reduction of negative externalities for the society and the environment. So they are not irrational through these lenses, because they are, even though they are not sticks with the homo economicus paradigm, because basically it's through the voluntary activity of shareholders or owners of the company that altruism is included into the company agreement and the company purpose clause. And so it's the interest of shareholders itself that it's broadened and include both the profit and so also the production of share value and benefits for the community. So Professor Calabresi approach helped me to find a way in justifying the existence in reality of this kind of structures.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And something you mentioned a few points in the paper is that it provides a new sort of intellectual framework for understanding it, but the actual phenomenon of companies having some measure of respecting social responsibility or altruism, that is not in itself necessarily new, because actually many companies have done that for a long time. Do you think that there is something genuinely new about the idea of enshrining that in a legal form, though, which seems to be what the B Corporation model particularly is all about? Is that something genuinely new, that it's kind of taken that broader fact that companies were doing things that were seemingly altruistic anyway, but has kind of turned it into a hard fact of governance and legal structure?
Yes, I think that the answer of the law to this request to firm altruism from for-profit companies, it's really important for several reasons. First of all, because of course, the introduction of a specific laws or regulation about the benefit corporation legal model that we have in the United States, in Italy, in France, and Spain, and in a lot of countries in South America. So it changed the idea of corporate law and also gives companies a structure path to follow. So if you really want to be a sustainable company, if you want to create a value for the community, you have, we can say, a box of rules that that is necessary that you follow. And I think that it's relevant because in that way, first of all, the altruistic purpose enter into the company agreement. It means that it's binding for shareholders in case of change of control. It's binding for directors because they have to pursue the goal included in the company agreement. Second, we have a consequence of this inclusion in the company agreement, which is relevant from the legal perspective. Why? Because directors are accountable for this. So they can be liable if they do not pursue also the altruistic purpose. This is different. This is not just the idea that they can do something, which could happen in ordinary companies, for example. Of course, depending on the legal system and the rules applicable to ordinary corporations. But they have to do something. And this is really relevant, I think, in terms of accountability. And also because another consequence from the practical perspective is that the inclusion to a company agreement and the accountability of directors put the idea of altruism and basically common benefit purpose into the company strategies. So it's not something which is outside. It's not strategies. It's not strategy, it's not CSR, sorry, but it's strategy. And so this is relevant. And the third consequence is that these companies have duty to disclose their impact. And so the transparency requirements are higher than ordinary corporation. And so I think this is the reason why a legal structures and legal provisions for this company are really useful.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting way of framing it. And I guess I just one sort of final question on the context of the paper and a slightly sort of how it fits in a broader perspective. The fact that we have these legal structures now that enshrine social purpose, in your view, does that mean that we should think of these things as an expansion of the non-profit sphere or an expansion of the commercial sphere? Or is it genuinely a sort of new fourth sector that we should view in a different way?
I tend to say that it's a new fourth sector because the idea of balancing the purposes, it's something different than we experienced in the past. But at the same time, I have to say that I see these dual purpose structures as more close to the for-profit. And this is the important things in my perspective, because it's like having a final goal, which is that all for-profit companies must move towards that direction. And so it's like creating a path for them and helping them to make the right moves in order to be sustainable for-profit companies. But nowadays, they are into a different sector, from my perspective, which is the fourth sector.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because there's a lot of questions, I think, about this being a positive development, but whether particularly from the perspective of the non-profit sphere, whether it is an alternative or an addition, or whether it should be viewed as something that's in competition with traditional nonprofits. And it's interesting, I think, to be clear about the fact that the goal is to drive for-profit activity in that direction. I just wanted to zoom out and ask sort of a question about your experience of trying to connect the work that you do in academia with practice, because obviously philanthropy and the non-profit world is an area in which the academic study of it is kind of inherently pretty linked to practice. But I've heard from lots of people the connections are not always as easy as you would hope. What have you found in terms of getting non-profit practitioners to engage in your research, or in terms of kind of disseminating the findings? Have you found that easy, or are there challenges?
Well, I have to say that I started to study this topic since almost 10 years ago. And at the beginning, it was very tough because we can say that there was no such development in terms of sustainability. We had a radical change in the last few years.
Yeah.
And but I have to say that I started studying this from the academic perspective. But soon after I started, I had the chance to put it into practice. Why? Because I had the chance to be in the working group, which in Italy helped the drafting of the bill that introduced the società benefit in Italy. And so we have consultations, and so we have linked with companies association. And then after the enactment of the law in Italy, I have been founding members and still work as an academic member of the scientific committee with the Italian Association of Società Benefit. So we are directly linked to practitioners, to entrepreneurs, and to people working in that area. And I can say that it was like they were waiting for something like this. It seems to me that there was a need in the society, in the entrepreneurs community. And I can say the same for what I'm doing now at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, because I'm continuing to work in this field. And we are trying to put together companies in order to understand their feedback on these new structures and on these new regulations. So I think that in the society, there's a big part of society which is really interested, and also companies are nowadays really interested in understanding the functioning and the boundaries of these new legal entities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does seem as though there's been a huge increase in appetite for that. And you touched on it there, but the other thing I just wanted to ask is what it is that you're working on now, whether it's, as you say, it sounds like some of it is a development of this work, and whether there are other kind of related areas that you're also interested in. Because I know often when I talk to people, the actual work they've done that features in these research notes is a few years old by the time it gets to the research notes. So.
Yes. So first of all, what I'm doing at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership is to develop a model law for dual purpose structures. So I'm undergoing a comparative law studies of all the existing regulation. We have about 10 jurisdictions. Well, in the US, we have a lot of them, but considering the US as one model, we have around 10 jurisdictions, we can say. And so through the comparative law analysis, the idea is to create a model law which should be applicable in different legal contexts, so different legal traditions, and for different kind of companies. So from small, medium enterprise to large enterprises, and it's going to be based on the US and also the civil law models that have been developed in Europe and in South America. And this is my goal right now. And the other area that I touched in my studies and I am continuing to investigate, it's private procurement and sustainable private procurement. So it has been really interesting to see the development of the European directive on sustainable corporate governance, which is mainly based on private procurement sustainability and due diligence activities. And I think that they are very close to the idea of dual purpose company, because one of the main aspects also in practice, I can say a dual purpose company is having a specific policy for procurement. And so I think that the two areas, and waiting for the outcome of the European discussion on it, are really important in order to see the for-profit corporation of the future, especially within the European Union.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. So it'll be really interesting to see when that comes out. Just remains to say thanks ever so much for finding time to come on the podcast. Really interesting to hear about the research, and all the best with it in the future.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I hope to see you soon.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to all of the interviewees for coming on the podcast, to Marlou, to Nina, and to Livia. It was great to hear about all of their work, and hopefully you really enjoyed it. As I say, I will put links in the show notes to places where you can find all of those research notes and all the rest of the ERNOP research notes on many other topics besides. I'll also put links to the actual papers that Marlou, Nina and Livia published so that you can read those in more depth if you want to. And I'll put some links also in the show notes to other places where you can find interesting topics that relate to some of the things we've been talking about. Obviously, if you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. You can follow me on social media if you like things in a much more short and fatuous form. You can find me on Twitter at Rodri_H_Davis. I'm increasingly on LinkedIn these days as Twitter, and refuse to call it X, sort of slowly implodes. I'm in various other places, although not really doing very much with those accounts at the moment, but, do feel free to tap me up. If you've got ideas for things that we could talk about on future episodes or people that I could interview, do drop me a line. The contact details are at the website. Other than that, just subscribe. Please do leave a nice review on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts if you get a chance, because that would really help. And other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!